Welcome back. We'll start in a minute or two, I think. I think it's been a good 5 minutes. Hello, Rosemarie. I see you. And Noel, how you been? Bill Barrett, yes, we're on a just short little break. We're about to start again. No problem if you're there. And everybody, just so you know, again, it's all being recorded, and you're all going to get a link with the recording. So if you want to watch it again or share it, I thank you for supporting my little project, the Attitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus. Hi, Bill Barrett, I see you. And I see some of you wrote in. I'll try to call on you later, Jim Wilson and Art and Bob Cushing. Bill Lewis, my book, Walking the Way, will answer your question. And Gordon, if you're around later, maybe you want to say a word. And I don't know, Marie Dennis, if you're still on, you want to say a little word later, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm on.
And Joe Cosgrove. So Joe may not be able to because he's going to be leaving. So I'm getting ready to start again in about a minute or so. Ruth Ann, has it been 5 minutes?
It's been a little more than 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, then we'll start.
You're ready, yeah.
Yes, it's your old friend, Bob Cushing, Bill. So I'm starting up again. This is part 2. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying these reflections and hearing from people and Bill and me. And again, the point was I invite, as we honor Dan on his 100th birthday, to reflect about your own life and the challenge before us and where we go. So we're going to start with another poem. This is my one I really like. And as Bill said, I have this wonderful collection of poems coming out soon by Dan. I'd say maybe 15 to 20% are new. And the idea was his most political, in-your-face poems. And it's called The Trouble with Our State. And I asked Bill Kellerman to write an introduction. So he went and wrote a whole new book, which was showing off Bill. And anyway, he wrote a fabulous introduction, and I hope you all get it. Anyway, here's the great poem, The Trouble with Our State. The trouble with our state was not civil disobedience, which in any case was hesitant and rare. Civil disobedience was rare as kidney stone. No, rarer, it was disappearing like immigrants' disease. You've heard of a war on cancer? There is no war like the plague of media. There is no war like routine. There is no war like 3 square meals. There is no war like a prevailing wind. It blows softly, whispers, don't rock the boat. The sails open, the ship of state rolls on. The trouble with our state, we learned it only afterward, when the dead resembled the living who resembled the dead, and civil virtue shone like paint on tin, and tin citizens and tin soldiers who marched to the common whip. Our trouble, the trouble with our state of soul, our state of siege, was civil obedience. Wow, that always gets me. So welcome back, dear friends. I'm gonna give a nice long second presentation now, if you can hang in there with me, and share some more stories and lessons on peacemaking to invite you to reflect on them and what you're learning from Dan and how you are fulfilling your vocation as a peacemaker and what further steps you can take as a follower of the nonviolent Jesus. Some of this you may have heard me say before or read in things I've written about Dan. I'm going to talk about Dan's focus on death and the culture of death and our response to it, and offer a series of points and observations and stories and lessons. But I don't know how to organize. You can't organize Dan. So I'm doing this this is a very gentle way, so just humor me, within 3 frameworks. Dan as an apostle of peace, Dan as a prophet of the God of peace, and Dan as a witness of the resurrection. And therefore, I'm going to invite you to consider how you are each one of those things. How are you an apostle of peace? How are you a prophet of the God of peace, or part of the prophetic people? How are you a witness of the resurrection? And I'm going to ask Bill to respond in any way you want, Bill, and then we can open it up. So again, this is my reflections on Dan after 40 years. For me, for Dan, God, okay? The living God was the God of life, and therefore the God of peace, not a God of death, which meant that for Dan, in my opinion, life was meant to be lived to the full, and death was meant to be resisted. And I'm really serious about this, because this is the thing that I heard him say over and over in over 100 retreats. In fact, Jesuits used to take Dan aside and say, "You're too obsessed with death." And I thought that was fair enough. And that's why Dan was so intriguing to me. More than anyone I knew, Dan talked about death, only as I used to hear him say it, it was death with a capital D. And what he meant by that was the great poem by Auden. I think the poem is September 1st, 1939. It was the beginning of World War II. Yeah, and you can look that up. He said that what we are up against is not war or capitalism or racism or nuclear weapons or environmental destruction, but death. Death itself, and therefore the metaphors and means of death. He's talking like St. Paul here in terms of the principalities and powers. That very first day I heard him speak at Kirkridge, he said, we use death as a social methodology. We are addicted to death as a social methodology. Therefore, through war and allowing billions of people to suffer and die in extreme poverty, or racism, or sexism, or corporate greed, or execution. You can go on and on. There's so many ways to talk about it. But ultimately, with 15,000 nuclear weapons, our preparations to blow up the world many times over, and our ongoing environmental destruction, our preparations literally destroy the planet. I heard Dan say that morning many times and over and over again. So he was saying, we do not work for death. We do not serve death. We're not slaves of the culture of death. He actually said this, we do not bring good things to death, which is a paraphrase on General Electric, where they did the Plowshares 8 action, which the motto was, we bring good things to life, which they done. And so he was saying, stand up and resist death or we'll be consumed by the culture of death. So here's I'm going to give you a lot of quotes. Here's a typical one, I think. Quote, one cannot level one's moral lance at every evil in the universe. There are just too many of them. But you can do something. And the difference between doing something and doing nothing is everything. Isn't that great? In other words, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So go and do something. That's what I'm trying to talk about here in the first part. An apostle is someone who is sent. But Jesus, in the end, in the resurrection, sends us all out. And I see Dan as someone who was sent on a mission of peace and discernment and nonviolence by God, by the risen Jesus. And he was trying to send everyone out for the rest of his life on the mission. He certainly did that with me. So I consider Dan an apostle of peace, and I thought I'd invite you to reflect on that, whether you knew Dan or not, and to ask yourselves, how could you be an apostle of peace? You know, how have you been one, and how can you be one more and more? I find that a very exciting question. For Dan, I think that meant a 24/7 commitment to the mission and work and life of gospel peacemaking. And that's, Peter, what I heard you talking about, Dan getting up at 6 a.m, whether he wanted to or not, and getting on that train and going off to speak in Bucks County. That's classic Dan. But he was like that in the 50s and the 40s. And if you don't believe me, go and study his archives. There was stuff there. You can ask me about this. I had no idea about how big his life was. He wrote and traveled and spoke everywhere pretty much he was invited. He met with everyone he could, rich and poor, and he joined public actions with the goal, as he said, of giving testimony, especially in court, as St. Luke says, to take the witness stand and testify to the truth. Some of you know that in the early 2000s, I said to him, he was going away for a week, and I said, I'm going to stay in your apartment. I'm reading all your papers. He had 2,000 unpublished pages in his desk alone. And I went through them all, and I said, okay, I'm going to make a book of them. And you have to come up with a title. And he called me. I moved to New Mexico by then, and he called me and said, okay, the title is Testimony. I thought that was so great. By the way, you can get that book. It's still in print. Harry Berrigan wrote me later that it was the greatest of all of Dan's books. And I think it is too. So I'm reflecting under the big umbrella here about being an apostle of peace. Now for Dan, that meant periodic, nonviolent civil disobedience. So I want to talk about that as a way to publicly resist war and injustice and nuclear weapons. And now Bill McKibben has been saying, my friend, we need that because of catastrophic climate change. And that's beginning to happen with Greta and Jane Fonda's Fire Drill Fridays movement, which Brad and I are part of, and Michelle. But this is all part of the so-called spiritual life or Christian witness, but as well as the methodology for social change. So for example, once, and he gets this from Howard Zinn, who used to quote Dan, and then that poem a lot, referring to all the movements in US history, if you're with me here, the abolitionists, to the suffragists, to the civil rights movement, then to the anti-war movement, and after Dr. King's death, the thousands of movements, the grassroots, people power, bottom-up movements of nonviolence that are changing the world right up to today. But Dan's take on it was, at some point, and Howard Zinn agreed with this, there's a frontline group in the movements of good people, in Dan's words, good people who break bad laws and accept the consequences. And that makes all the difference. I loved that and used to talk about that with Dan. So once, as you know, Mike Wallace came and followed Dan and Liz and Phil around for a year. We were hosting Mike Wallace, St. Al's in DC, this is 1987, and the film crew. And I did this event there in the basement of the church, and someone raised a hand and asked Dan, well, what's your philosophy of civil disobedience? And Dan said, well, Dan, civil disobedience is like a spiritual enema. You just feel clean and a whole lot better afterwards. The whole place erupted in laughter. I didn't know what to make of that. And Mike Wallace thought that was so funny. He put it in the 60 Minutes episode. So, if you're engaging in resistance and civil disobedience as a way of life, one of the very key teachings, again, I'm trying to offer my opinion, Dan's key teachings and lessons. One of them was to let go of results and to work for justice and disarmament and peace as an ordinary part of our day-to-day lives, whether or not we make a difference. Gandhi talked about to have a non-attachment to the fruit of your actions. But I think Dan got this from Merton, and I don't know if Jim Forrest is on Zoom, but he will be, or we'll watch it. I mean, when I first met Dan that weekend, Dan stood up at Kirkridge and read Merton's famous letter to Jim Forrest, where Merton says, peace work is, go and read it, the letter. Peace work is an apostolic work. and therefore do not depend on the hope of results. You give your life and you do the work, but you don't place your hope in the results of your work, but your hope is in God. And that became critical for Dan, especially in his last years. I saw him saying that to so many different people. Do the good because it's good. Speak the truth because it's true. Work for justice and peace because that's what the God of peace and justice wants. You do what you can and you leave the outcome in God's hands, which is very liberating, by the way. Then you're not stuck on I'm doing it. And it's not so much your ego trip. It's very healing too. We're just doing God's work, but the work is God's, not mine. I'm not in charge. That's lovely. And so nonviolence then and nonviolent resistance to the culture of death is just an ordinary part of life. And we are trusting in God that it will one day bear good fruit. Well, how are you doing with that? I invite you to reflect on that. Here's a great quote on this from Dan. The good is to be done because it's good, not because it goes somewhere. I believe if it is done in this good spirit, it will go somewhere, but I don't know where. I don't think the Bible grants us to know where it goes or in what direction, but I have never been seriously interested in the outcome. I was always interested in trying to do it humanly and carefully and nonviolently and let it go. Wow, the more as I prepare these thoughts on reflections on Dan, I thought that sentence is one of the most critical ones, summing on Dan's life and his way of operating. You know, I thought that the Jesuits always used to dismiss Dan as by saying, oh, they would to me, but to Dan too, oh, you're just a poet. But Dan was a genius and he knew what he was doing. So listen to again what he's saying. I know this is true. And as a kid, it made me mad. And I told him so. He was not interested in the outcome. He was interested in following Jesus, who's carrying the cross. You know, Jesus is not successful, effective, or relevant. And why do you think you are, John, or we are? So that's going to be your outcome. No, I'm going to read it again. I was interested in trying to do all of this piecework humanly. Wow, that's very important. Carefully and non-violently, and then let it go. I could give a whole speech on Dan's philosophy of letting it go. It was a mantra for him because he told me about this over many decades. But here's another quote. Nobody can sustain him or herself in this nonviolent struggle for a new nonviolent world on the basis of the criterion of immediate success. This is very important, Dan. The Bible gives us a long view rather than the expectation of a quick fix. All of us are in grave danger of being infected by this American ethos that good work brings quick change, rather than the older spiritual notion that good work is its own justification and that the outcome is in other hands besides ours. Isn't that fantastic? It's a very profound apostolic teaching. So if our work for peace and justice and a new world and so forth is essentially apostolic, then we just go forward resisting death and living life and spreading life and trusting God. And the outcome is in God's hands, and we're free instruments of God's peace, and it's just lovely. So I got this as a kid. Now I come in from a full-scale all-American family out to make a difference, and at age 21, he was trying to knock that out of me. And I don't think he quite succeeded, but he said to me when I was 21 one day, Michelle, late at night, kid, if you're going to spend your life resisting death, you better learn how to live life to the full. Wow, was that helpful? Very helpful teaching. I'm very serious. Because a lot of people had Dan and certainly Phil, I would say, as real hardcore activists. And there's a lot of hardcore activists out there. But Dan had another thing going, which I later saw in people like Archbishop Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh, even Mother Teresa, who were making a big difference in the world, but wow, were they living life to the full. And in other words, they were having a good time and fun. And people would say that about Gandhi and Dr. King. And they're making a much bigger difference, by the way, than being really hardcore. You see my point? I saw that he did that very well. Always from the beginning. He walked every day of his entire life. He only ate healthy food. He never ate desserts his whole life. He enjoyed his evening friends and having a drink with friends and laughter and nature and poetry and books and people. You may have seen the article this week that our friend Sister Helen Prejean wrote. She used to come and visit us all the time, and Dan just wanted her to recite Cajun jokes. And so we just had hilarious evenings with Helen. That's Dan, that aside that a lot of people didn't know. I probably shouldn't tell this story, but if you were there with him, we had community mass almost every day. And then we'd have drinks as Jesuits and then dinner. Once a month, we invited all our friends to come, but this was every night for us. And we'd have communion and we'd end the mass. And then for decades, we all used to turn to Dan, and he made this ritual announcement to our little community. We've been good long enough. And we would always break out and laugh. It was still funny, till the end. So I want to tell one story. This is just to try to make you laugh, which may or may not work. I hope you're still here with me, you all, if you're still with me. Dan's, I think it was his 80th birthday. And Martin Sheen gives Dan 2 first-class tickets to Ireland. Dan invited me, and so we had planned a whole nice 2-week vacation in Ireland because we both had many friends over there. But 2 weeks before we went, the word had spread, and someone had organized a 2-week national speaking tour without telling us. Every night, this massive event was going to be happening in some city. Well, of course, neither of us wanted to do that. But Dan said, okay, let's do one. Let's do it on the first day. I know we have a friend from Dublin there. I don't know if you were there. This was sometime, I think, in 2002. The first night we arrived, we were going to speak at the Jesuit High School in Dublin, where James Joyce went. And we get there, and there's a press conference announced, and the entire national press is there to hear Dan. He was front page news the next day because he was such a hero. It was like Martin Luther King was coming to Ireland. Remember, for example, Bobby Sands, who went on the hunger strike and died. His last wish to Margaret Thatcher was that Daniel Berrigan could come and visit him. Could I meet Father Dan before I met? Margaret Thatcher refused to let Dan in. I could go on and on with these stories. Anyway, 2,000 people showed up for the speech. And the auditorium could only hold 1,000. 1,000 had to be turned away. I'm getting carried away here, but Dan read a bunch of poems. I gave a talk on nonviolence. There's a question and answer period. Someone asked us about Palestine, and Dan and I said, well, we call for the end of the occupation. And someone stood up and said, how dare you? Remember, there's 1,000 people out there. Started yelling at us. Another person stood up and started yelling at him. Then people started popping up and yelling at each other throughout the auditorium. And then the first two broke out into a big fist fight right there in the middle of the whole auditorium during our lovely evening on nonviolence. And the evening ended. And it led, by the way, to the Shannon Plowshares action, that whole gathering. But we were brought backstage, and there were a bunch of priest friends of ours there, and they were all heroes who had very difficult, hard lives and so forth. And they were elated. And they said, well, you don't know is that in Ireland for 200 years, especially in Dublin, an evening isn't a success unless it breaks out into a fist fight. And so Dan and I were just laughing about that and kind of stunned. But that wasn't even the point of my story. The story that I wanted to tell you was the Jesuits drop us off at JFK Airport, and we're going into the first class Aer Lingus lounge, thanks to Martin Sheen, and before boarding the flight, and as we open the door to the Aer Lingus lounge, these three beautiful ladies, all dressed in green, walk up to us. One of them has a tray of champagne glasses. Another has a tray of shrimp cocktails. And then third has a tray of cappuccinos. And they all smile and say, welcome, help yourself as much as you want. To which Dan turns to me and goes, quick, call Martin. Tell him we're canceling the trip and we're going to stay in the Aer Lingus Lounge for the next 2 weeks. Well, that was my joke. I don't know if you like that, but that to me was like classic Dan Berrigan. And, you know, we just had so much fun with his friends. He was a lot of fun to be like that and very sharp-witted. Well, believe it or not, I'm trying to talk about Dan as an apostle of peace, and that means he believed in hope. And he believed in believing in hope even when there was no hope. So that he insisted on hope in the same way as his friend Thomas Merton, that hope often looks like and feels like despair because it's the hope of Jesus on the cross. And Dan refused to give in despair. I know because I kept testing him on it. When I was 21, that first conversation, he said, we can't afford the luxury of despair. And there were very many times, especially when I was a kid, when I would be down about something. I didn't understand any of this, and I'd be really despairing and start going on about it. And he would stop me in mid-sentence, just say, cut that out. We're not going there. It's not that bad. You're wrong. Let's have a joke and let's live life. And he really, really helped me. And I'm telling this because I thought this was a very serious part of Dan. And he chose to live in hope. So, for example, once I was a Jesuit novice and my life was changing quickly, and I went to see him, and I had a long list of complaints, Dan. Everyone is mad at me. The novice master and the provincial have told me they're considering dismissing me because I engaged in civil disobedience. None of the other novices want to talk about peace and justice, or for that matter, Jesus. My family's upset with me. My old college friends don't even want to talk to me. Nothing's working out. And I'm going on and on like this. It's grim, man. And he looks at me and sits back and says, well, at least it ain't dull. And we both burst out laughing. And that helped me so much. So I'm trying to pass on some lesson here that he really did get through to me. And he said around that time, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. And I think that's a very great lesson of Daniel Berrigan's. Once, you know, he was speaking to 500 people before they crossed the line out the SAC base in Omaha. This was, as some of you may remember, in 1985. Hundreds got arrested. And in the speech, he told the crowd, we're going to reverse Dante and say, take on hope, all ye who enter here. That's great. Here's another great Dan quote. I'm trying to talk about him as an apostle. We walk our hope. That's the only way of keeping it going. We've got faith, we've got one another, we've got religious discipline, and we've got some access that goes beyond and over the official wall. Isn't that great? So what I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, Dan never thought we were powerless. There's always something you can do. And I think that's the point of active nonviolence, gospel nonviolence, and Jesus. We could always try to make a difference. I heard them say that over and over again. And, you know, in the Plowshares 8 trial, he said that famously during his speech. You know, I had this big word for it, in effect, he was saying. There was a long pause, and he called it responsibility. We each have a personal responsibility for the whole world, for what our country is doing in the world, for war and nuclear weapons and destruction of the environment and racism and so forth. It's our responsibility to do something to stop it. So I invite you as an apostle of peace to reflect on how you are doing the good because it's good, and being hopeful and taking responsibility and leaving the outcome in God's hands. That's my first point. The second one, if you're still with me, you know, a lot of people call Dan a prophet, and Phil too, including Dorothy Day, in her essay called Dan and Phil, Priests and Prophets. So I think of Dan as a prophet of the God of peace. And I went to, you don't hear about prophets of peace and justice in the media or creation, but there are a lot of them out there in the world, if you're listening carefully, such as Greta Thunberg, such as Parkland kids, such as Black Lives Matters, and go on. You can go on and on. And so I wanted to reflect with us about how we're all can be prophets of the God of peace, or another way of looking at that, members of prophetic communities who speak out. Isn't that lovely? Or prophetic grassroots movements, if you prefer that, and what that means and how's that going for you. Dan, one way to put that is this way of speaking over and over again that Bill quoted so beautifully from that obscure, at least was for me, poem that's going to be in the new book. Dan talked about over and over again, saying yes and saying no. I think that's Dan's translation from the Sermon on the Mount. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And you don't need to say any more than that. We say no to war, no to violence, no to racism, no to the death penalty, no to nuclear weapons, no to environmental destruction. You can go on and on. No to deporting immigrants and so forth. Yes to life, yes to peace, yes to community, yes to nonviolence, yes to racial justice. You go on and on again. For him, yes to humanity. Here's a quote. I know that the prophetic vision is not popular today in some spiritual circles. I think that's an understatement, but I'll continue. Our task is not to be popular or to be seen as having an impact, but to speak the deepest truths that we know. We need to live our lives in accord with the deepest truths we know, even if doing so does not produce immediate results in the world. Merton would add, even if our results are counterproductive. Not everybody would agree to this. I wonder if Dr. King would agree to this, but that's a very powerful teaching and maybe a bit Buddhist. So he goes on, I want to read a little more. I draw from the prophets, remember he wrote 20 books on the prophets, a very strong bias in favor of the victim and a very strong sense of judgment of the evil structures and those who run them. This is very serious stuff here. The prophets and Christ talk about the God who stands at the bottom with the victims and with the widows and orphans and witnesses with them in the world from that terrifying vantage point, which is like the bottom of the dry well where Jeremiah was thrown into. So that's our vantage point, and it defines the crime and the sin. The point of view of the victim indicts the unjust, the oppressor, the killer, the war maker. And so the message is very clear. It's an indictment of every superpower in the world, from Babylon to Washington, D.C. He's talking about the bottom. And so we could all maybe reflect on ways we've read or heard Dan speak like that. I'm not sure this story fits, but it's a story that was just amazing to me. As you know, right after 9/11, I was working at Ground Zero, and I came home around November 2001. And that whole day, I turned on NPR, was listening to the news, and they announced that all the U.S. Catholic bishops, except for 4, had just voted to fully support the U.S. war on Afghanistan. And I went up to, I was going to have a drink with Dan late that night. And I told him this, and his response was just amazing to me. He said, well, we should just throw out the Gospels. And from now on, ask everyone in the world to proceed into Mass with the Air Force rule book and incense it, and read the great commandment, kill your enemies, because that's what we really believe. That's the way Dan thought and spoke his whole life. To me, that was a typical Dan story, and I have like 100 others like that. Now, so I don't know if this is going to be helpful, But if you're still hanging in there with me, I wanted to talk a little bit about whatever, the spirituality of prophecy. So I have some points I want to go through because I've been watching Dan all my life. And just because we never hear about this, we don't talk about it so much, whereas Dan did. So this is just friendly for your reflection. A prophet is someone who listens attentively to the word of God, a contemplative, a mystic who hears God and takes God at God's word very seriously, and then goes into the world and tells the world what God is saying. That's my take on Daniel Berrigan. Prophet speaks fearlessly. Dan told me 100 times, and lets the chips fall where they may. That was Dan for you. Second, morning, noon, and night, the prophet is centered on God. The prophet does not do his or her own will or speak his or her own message. The prophet does God's will and speaks God's message. And therefore, you could say, in effect, the prophet is a nonviolent spokesperson for the God of peace. God is invariably sending the prophet with a word to proclaim, go say to my people, thus says God. And in the sense, then the prophet is telling the world about God and also what it means to be a human. Now you can go, well, that's all very lovely, John, but I'll give you a tiny example. One day, this was in the 80s, a reporter, I think from the Associated Press, called Dan when John Paul, the Pope, was visiting, and said, oh, Father Berrigan, yes. What do you think about Pope John Paul II? Trying to get Dan in a provocative state. And Dan told me this later that night. Dan said it very simply, sincerely, and off the top of his head. I said to the Associated Press reporter, whatever God thinks about John Paul II is good enough for me. That's what I think. And he left it at that. And the reporter was shocked and appalled because, of course, you could take that in so many ways. But you see, he changed the focus back onto God. That's what I'm trying to say. Third, a prophet interprets the signs of the times. A prophet is concerned with the world, with the whole human race, not just our little corner of the world. That's why the prophet sees the big picture of war and starvation and global racism, nationalism, systemic violence, and especially nuclear weapons and environmental destruction that are trying to destroy God's planet. Saying, we can destroy in 15 minutes, God, what you took 15 billion years to create. So the prophet is looking at the world from God's eyes, not through the eyes of the nation state. Therefore, fourth, a prophet takes sides. This is hard in the American culture, the cultural church. A prophet stands in solidarity with the world's poor, the powerless, the marginalized, the crucified peoples of the world, and the crucified earth, and becomes a voice for the voiceless. And Dan wrote about this a lot. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible are concerned with one main task, justice and peace, calling people to act justly and to create social, racial, and economic justice as the basis for a new world of peace. And that's what God's want. And so we have to go and say that. 6, prophets announce and denounce. And you go, okay, that's actually, I heard Dan talk about that dozens of times based on the book of Revelation and the book of Jeremiah. Prophets publicly denounce the world's injustice and publicly announce the coming of God's reigns of justice and peace. That means 7th, a prophet confronts the status quo, rocks the boat, shakes our complacency, and agitates boldly for change. Therefore, prophets don't make us feel comfortable, which is what most religious, career-minded folk try to do. Make us feel comfortable, because then you make money. So the prophets don't make money. 8th, more often than not, therefore, the prophet is in trouble. That was a very big point for Dan. As the measure of our discipleship is how much trouble we're in with the government. Prophets call us to love our enemies, topple the idols, defend the poor, break the laws which legalize mass murder, and so forth. And so the culture is going to take offense, and the prophet is marginalized and outcast and rejected, or sometimes jailed or killed. And this is the will of God, the way it works. The story of Jeremiah to Jesus to Dr. King. Ninth, prophets especially bring the word of God upon religious institutions. And they criticize the blindness and complacency of religious leaders, which means for us, bishops, priests, ministers, who are keeping silent in the face of national crimes. And so usually the religious institution rejects the prophet and kicks him out. But that's okay because God is always found in the margins anyway. Finally, in the Sermon on the Mount, it clearly says there, Jesus says he wants us to become prophets. If you study the Sermon on the Mount, as Dan did, he teaches the Sermon on the Mount and says, even when you get persecuted, rejoice and be glad. This is Jesus. Your reward will be great because now you get to be like the prophets of old. Now you get to be Isaiah and Jeremiah and Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Rosa Parks and Martin King and Daniel and Philip Berrigan. So Jesus wants us to be a prophetic people. And I hope you didn't mind me sharing all that because that's what I think of when I think of Dan. So I can talk about how I think that we can translate that. But here's a classic, one of a million quotes from Dan, which is, if you will, Dan talking like a Hebrew prophet. In the name of the gospel, I condemn the speech of power politics, the speech of military murder, the language of religious mystification, all language that indicates the death of the mind, the studied obscenity, the speech that pretends to human dignity and truth, while in fact it brings down the world. And I recommend, in the name of the gospel, modesty and loyalty, the springs that flow in the desert, all the hidden efforts to live with human difference, to bear with crisis, to bind the wounds, to be patient and long-suffering. Isn't that lovely? I don't know if any of this is helpful, but I've been trying to say Dan is an apostle of peace, Dan is a prophet of peace, and the third and last thing I want to talk about is Dan as a witness of the resurrection. This is from the Acts of the Apostles. And in this, wow, this is really, really important to me. I think Bill has heard me say this before. So this is my conclusion, and this is the most important thing that I have learned from Daniel Berrigan, okay? Dan lived as if the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus happened. That there's reason for hope. That the outcome, in fact, was always in better hands than ours. And so all we have to do is go forward and enact that hope and organize grassroots movements and nonviolent actions for disarmament, justice, peace, all of creation, and quote, as he said to me, live out the drama of the disarmed, risen Christ in a world armed to the teeth. So a few stories. Once, this was 20 years ago, Dan and me and our friend Bob Keck went and had mass and a picnic on Easter Sunday in Central Park. Don't tell anybody, I'll get in more trouble. But we're sitting there talking about the resurrection. It was a fabulous day, and I said, being me, well, if I were the savior of the world and you all betrayed me and executed me, I'd never come back. I'd never rise. I'd be resentful and angry, you know? And Jesus comes back and makes breakfast for these people. And I started to reflect on how Jesus had no resentment, no revenge, no anger in him, before or after his death, you know? To which Dan said, I'll never forget it. Jesus didn't have a mean bone in his body. And I love that. I really love that. I'm trying to share with you some lessons I learned from Dan. So a year before Dan died, I drove Dan up to Syracuse to see his older brother, Jerry, who was dying and would die 3 months later. And it was Easter weekend. And they asked me to have a little mass. So we had mass with Jerry and Carol Berrigan, their daughter, my friend Carla Berrigan, and Dan and I. And the gospel was about John, from John 20, the risen Jesus standing by the Sea of Galilee. Only 5 of us. And I reflected on that. And I said, would anybody else like to speak? Now, Dan is very, very feeble. This is last year. And he can only whisper. Okay, are you with me on this? There's only 5 of us. The whole town wanted to see him. And in fact, we went out to lunch with 50 people afterwards, but we're just this intimate friends and family. And Dan leaned forward and said, well, I'm noticing that in the presence of the risen Jesus, there is no more war. There is no violence. There are no bombs. There's no guns. There's no killing, there's no destruction, and there's no death. We were all very quiet for a long time. Carla and I were shocked and still talk about that moment as one of the highlights of our entire lives. Now you're going, John, that's just so obvious or so basic. But I invite you to really think about what Dan said. I think it's shocking. I think it's a revelation that in the presence of the risen, nonviolent Jesus, Dan is saying there is total peace, total nonviolence, universal love, universal compassion. And that's where we're all headed, to the presence of the risen, nonviolent Jesus. And this is a good thing. So I always have thought of Dan as a person of resurrection, who was living in the presence of the risen Jesus, if you will. And he was a witness of the resurrection more than anyone that I've ever met. And someone who practiced and taught resurrection. I heard him say this quote over and over again for 40 years. Here's the quote: death does not get the last word. The other quote I heard him say over and over again, Peter, you probably heard him at Kirkridge. Peter went to almost every one of Dan's retreat for 35 years at Kirkridge. He would always say, there's a slight edge of life over death. A slight edge of life over death. Life barely wins out. And that's kind of classic Dan, but something he was trying to teach me. So I want to sort of end here with one of the greatest writings that I think Dan ever wrote. You may not think so. I think I'm going to be a little over the top, as my friend Jackson says about one of the greatest writings about Jesus and resurrection. How's that for over the top? It's in the most obscure place, the Encyclopedia of Autobiography. Nobody has ever seen it. But I put it at the end of my book, Essential Writing. So you may have already read it as the very conclusion, because I think it's an amazing description of Jesus from a Daniel Berrigan perspective. And I want to invite us to listen to it and to reflect on it. And then I'm going to ask Bill to comment. So here's Dan. Once there was a dead man, a criminal, a subject of capital punishment. And lo, he refused to stay dead. He stood up as the authorities shortly came to sense. This was an earthquake in nature, in the nature of law and order, in the nature of death, the nature of war. For in the nature of things, as defined by the nation state, a great one for deciding what the nature of things is, the whole law says, dead men stay dead. The word from Big Brother, the word that gives them clout, inspires fear, is a criminal once disposed of stays disposed. Not at all. Along come these crazies shouting in public, our man's not dead. He's risen. This is Dan. Now I submit you can't have such a word going around and still run the state properly. The first nonviolent revolution, therefore, was, of course, the resurrection. And the event had to include death as its first act, and also the command to Peter, put up your sword. so that it might be clear once and for all that Christians suffer death rather than inflict it. He goes on, all worldly systems and arrangements are simply bypassed by the resurrection. If death has no hold over people in the sense that they've exercised their fear of death, then what's worth left fearing, or worth hoping for that matter, from any worldly structure? They all deserve, one and all, the feisty appellation conferred on them by Dorothy Day, the filthy, rotten system. I take it she was referring to their main function, multiplying the metaphors and means of death. The end of such a world, Dorothy realized and regarded it, was not just near. The end has already occurred. I find this very profound and hopeful. So Dan talked and practiced resurrection. He acted as if someone was risen from the dead, that death had no longer had its power over us, that we need not fear death, that we need not be ruled by the state, which only has death as its ultimate form of punishment, which might be translated today into arrest and jailing, that we are freed from death, and we can go forward and resist non-violently, knowing the slight edge of life over death. That's why I now define resurrection as having, if you're still with me here, nothing to do with death, or having not a trace of violence in you, as Dan said about Jesus. Resurrection means total non-violence. Dan knew our survival was already guaranteed, so we need not be afraid. We don't need to be violent or discouraged. We're heading toward resurrection. So don't be afraid of death or cooperate with the big business of death. Here's the final conclusion of that statement. Since 1980, or the book actually, since 1980 and all the plowshares' actions, some of us continue to labor to break the demonic clutch on our souls, the ethic of Mars, of wars and rumors of wars, inevitable wars, just wars, necessary wars, victorious wars, and say our no in acts of hope. For us, all these repeated arrests, the interminable jailings, the life of our small communities, the discipline of nonviolence, these embody an ethic of resurrection. Simply put, we long to taste that event, its thunders and quakes, its great yes. We want to test the resurrection in our bones, to see if we might live in hope instead of the thicket of cultural despair, nuclear despair, a world of perpetual war. We want to taste the resurrection. May I say we have not been disappointed. My hope and prayer is that we too can be witnesses of the resurrection, like Dan, and get ready for resurrection and strive to taste the resurrection. And that someday, like Dan, we will be able to say, we were not disappointed. Thanks for listening. Welcome, Bill Wiley-Kellerman.
Thanks, Jan. That was really very, really thought-provoking but powerful, and I think lays a claim on all of us. Not so much to reflect on again. Maybe starting with death, death with a capital D. Death. The definition of the state is actually the institution, the structure that holds the so-called legitimate power of death in execution, in imprisonment, in war. And in our case, certainly thinking of America as Babylon, where death is underneath everything, you know, from indigenous genocide to chattel slavery, oil wars, I mean, ultimately, nuclear weapons and first strike policy are the epitome of that, and spiritually connected to our willingness to incinerate the planet more slowly by by the assaults of climate. I mentioned earlier this poem of Dan's, and it's one, the letter to the Vietnamese. It's one I once learned by heart, and I'm thinking of a section of it that I'll share. It says, "Here they hawk death in the streets, death in the heart, death in the Hamburg joint, death in the cobbler's hammer, death in the jeweler's glass, the classy showrooms of death. Death," shouts the newsboy, "death, oranges, lemons, death in a candy wrapper. But beyond it all, out of sight and mind, like an aquarium at midnight, like the eyes of a captive tiger, a colony of golden eyes of bees in their cells, the miser's mine of jewels throttling the moon underground, you and I, our eyes like grapes beneath the nailed boot, our why dragged in the dust, a flayed animal's entrail, or how long as the lifeline thrown from God to Job. If I were free, the phrase flies from the mind like a two-edged sword. If I were free, I would be your angel of deliverance, all my friends. Between you and me, the evening star arises, the jewel of Buddha. That compassionate mind encompasses the heavens, and between those hands, their flower-like texture and repose, nothing is lost. I think it's ultimately a resurrection poem, and that's just actually just a little section of it. There's a way, and I think about death with a capital D. Death is a power. Death is organic to creation, to life itself, right? To the composting, to returning to earth. From earth we come and to earth we return. But when we're anxious about that, when we fear it, when we wield it as a power, it becomes inflated as a power, embodied, as I say, in the extreme in nuclear weapons. And what you're talking about in terms of the freedom of the resurrection, freedom from the fear of death, on the one hand is the freedom to die. I mean, Jesus goes to Jerusalem and to the cross with that freedom. He says, "Nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down." Right? He goes with that kind of freedom, which is simultaneously, as you said, is also the freedom to live life fully and completely, risking, everything. So this matter of letting go, non-attached to results, that's a resurrection ethic. I was remembering when Scott Kennedy, who some of you would know, once asked Bill Stringfellow, "What do you mean by the resurrection?" And Stringfellow paused and he said, "Dan and Phil Berrigan in jail," which seemed really cryptic at the time. And then I've heard him say more on it later, that he and Anthony tried to visit Dan and Phil in prison, and the whole process was very freighted, and it was clear that the chaplain, the warden, they were all anxious and in bondage to, higher powers, and actually seeing Dan and Phil, while they were certainly discomfited, he said, they were completely free in prison. I mean, that's That's the freedom of the resurrection and the ethic of the resurrection. So I'm totally on board with all you're saying and with all you're bringing to us from Dan on that score. I only wanted to mention, additionally, in terms of prophet, his friendship with Abraham Heschel.
Yeah.
When he came to Union, well, he came to Woodstock College, but when he got out of Danbury, but he taught for a year there, and we had cross registration from Union Seminary, which is where I was, and Heschel was across the street at Jewish Theological, and their friendship was very deep. He commended his 2-volume book, The Prophets, to us. I never got to take classes from him, though we could have. We also had cross registration there, but because he died in I think in '73. But they founded Clergy and Laity against the war together. And anyway, I think Dan, as you say, wrote books on every single one of the Hebrew prophets, and in that, I think he took a lot from Heschel. He wished Heschel were around at the point where I include a speech in the book that he gave to the Association of Arab American University graduates in October of '73, which was in the midst of the October Yom Kippur War. And he took a lot of heat for that speech. And I know he really wished for Heschel in the wake of that. But anyway, I think of that. So many things he did were in the prophetic vein, but that's certainly, in my book, chief among them.
Thank you, Bill. You know, Bill, Heschel, he had a very weak heart, and he was under doctor's orders not to leave the apartment. And it was announced that Phil was being released from jail. And Heschel asked Dan, could he go up on the bus to Danbury for Phil's release, which meant getting up at 6 a.m, totally against doctor's orders. And, there's that famous picture of the two of them on the bus, and Heschel says, can I read my morning prayers? So he prayed the whole way up there. Phil gets released, and then next day or 2 or 3, Heschel died.
Right.
Because he went and saw Phil released. I mean, it's very moving, and Dan kind of just was beautiful. Bill, you want to say a little bit about the party tomorrow, just while we got you here?
Yeah, just quick. There are a number of folks who are part of the book. Frida wrote a gorgeous forward to it. There's a young Catholic worker here, Kateri Boucher, who wrote an afterword about the next generation, and folks like John Bach and Kathy Kelly and Eric Martin and Jim Reale wrote letters that ended up being included in the book. All of them are going to participate tomorrow, along with I know you're going to say a word. Charlie King is singing. It's really a birthday party. We'll end with toasting. So there'll be an opportunity to tell stories and lift a glass to Dan. It starts at 7:30. I put the link to registering for it in the chat. Everybody's welcome, and I'm kind of excited and looking forward to it.
Great, Bill. So hey, everybody, hope you'll join us, and it's all free if you want. I'm going to ask my friend Joe Cosgrove to say a word, and then Frida and Liz, if you want to say a word, and then start calling on some people. And I know there are comments and all, and we have a little time. So I know Joe has to go, so that's why I'm calling on him now. Welcome, Joe Cosgrove from Pennsylvania. And Bill, by the way, thanks a lot, Bill Wiley-Kellerman. How about a round of applause for the great Bill Kellerman and his book? Yay, Bill. Hey, Bill.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. And Thank you for this wonderful remembrance of Dan and really a resurrecting moment to be with him again. You know, Dan has a way of gathering us together at the most unexpected times and in the most unexpected ways and in the most freeing ways. And his memory is so alive. We're in this novena of Berrigan, you know, the 9 days between the anniversary of his death and his birthday. And, you know, as a traditional old Catholic, maybe we should have a Berrigan novena every year. There are just two things I want to say, and there's 10,000 stories of Dan and 10,000 things we can say about him. But two things, just as a lawyer, I can't tell you how many times Dan was like an old Irish pastor and calling me with someone that had contacted him who, you know, can you help this person out? They need this or they need that. And well, Dan, it looks like a pretty hopeless case. And he was sort of a St. Jude who called on lawyers. He did this with Ramsey Clark countless times. And, you know, it was just, there was no one who Dan turned away. And then there was this other side of Dan that, you know, he certainly knew where he stood and we knew where he stood, but he was not judgmental. And that was a skill that, boy, I sure don't have. He was able to be certain about what he knew and what the truth was, and didn't condemn, invited. And I think that only infuriated people even more. You know, if he would get in the scrap with someone, that was one thing. He wouldn't do that. He welcomed. He came to Notre Dame when I was in law school, and there was a military person at the dinner table, and he engaged. And I think he left that person just completely flummoxed at the end. That he couldn't dislike Dan, and he couldn't. He was disarmed, and I think that annoyed him. So thank you, John. Thanks for putting this together, and hello to all our dear friends, and hugs to you all. And thanks for taking me out of turn here.
Thanks, Joe. Gosh, yeah, those are beautiful things. I'm you know, it reminds me of, well, I think Thich Nhat Hanh had a helpful influence on Dan on that. I'm recalling Dan's famous story of having dinner with Sergeant Shriver, who's a really close friend of Dan's, the Kennedys. And Secretary McNamara is there, height of the Vietnam War, and Sergeant Shriver says, well, we've got Father Berrigan, we've got Secretary McNamara, let's go at it. And, you know, Dan just, you didn't end the war this morning, so please end the war tonight. That's all Dan would say. He just wouldn't fight. And McNamara was crazy. He said, well, Vietnam is like Mississippi. You have to go in every now and then and bring in the troops and get the border going. It's just insane. Anyway, so I'm wondering if Frida and Liz would like to share something if they're there somewhere. If you're unmuted, now's your big chance. You don't have to, Frida or Liz. It's all user friendly.
Well, I think that for both of us, it's been a joy to be here, a joy to be interacting with all of you, and a joy to be witnessing this beautiful period of time together. It's so important that we take these periods of time to try to continue to keep ourselves alive to what needs to be done, to keep ourselves alive to the needs of others, to keep ourselves alive to the fact that we need to keep on keeping on in terms of witnessing, in terms of saying no to war making, no to the filthy, rotten system. So it's such a grace to do that with others. It's been a joy to have this time. And the mixing of it with so many other people, what a gift. We go home richer. We go home more and more energized to keep on keeping on, to keep on saying no to death and destruction, and saying yes to community, saying yes to love, saying yes to all the work we are trying to do to make this a safer and more loving and more holy time, more holy period in our history. So each interaction with each person since we have been doing this has been a profound gift, and everyone that we have interacted with has contributed something super special.
Yeah.
And everyone is important, and it's such an uplift to have this time. And I can only say that and emphasize it and say we have to keep doing this with one another, because we so need that with one another, because so much out there is anti what we are trying to witness to, what we are trying to become, what we are trying to create. So I think that it's a treasure to have these times together. And I think Frida and I have both felt that so strongly in the days we've been here. Deep gratitude.
Great.
Go ahead.
No, that's
Thanks,
it.
Liz.
Thank you. Amen.
Thank you so much.
Oh, Frida, aren't you going to jump in and add your own 2 cents? This is your big chance, Frida Berrigan. No? Okay. Marie Dennis, what do you think about all this carrying on? So Marie is former head of Pax Christi International, led the Vatican Conference on Nonviolence, and is going to do a great workshop in June, the Attitude Center. My friend in Washington, D.C. at the CC community. And I want to invite Marie to share a little bit.
Thanks, John. I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to being with you next month. Just a huge thank you to you, to Bill for the book, to you, John, for this really beautiful opportunity to sit at the feet of a poet and prophet, and to be in the virtual presence of so many friends and witnesses to the gospel who have led the way and inspired me on this long journey, finally, to nonviolence. Thank you, John. And it was a beautiful day. It's great to be with you.
Okay, well, thanks, Marie. And I hope folks can come to her workshop and others. So I see Art laughing wherever you are, or if you're there, maybe you want to jump in and unmute yourself. You wanted to make a comment. Art, are you still around?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Welcome. Art
Brother,
Laughlin of the Dorothy Day
listen.
Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C., longtime friend of Dan's.
Well, I'm just, this is a gift beyond measure. This treasure that you're sharing about Dan and Bill and Dean and Chet, so many who have shared. And I go back with Dan to 1977. John, like you, I was trying to find my way. I called Dan out of the blue and asked if I could come and visit. And he said, sure, come on down. I was living in Connecticut at the time. And I was just so moved by his hospitality. And out of that, the friendship that was formed, which has lasted, right up to the time he died. And one of the great gifts I think that you've mentioned in different ways is his connecting the altar to the Pentagon. I always remember he wrote a piece about the altar and the Pentagon. And out of our faith and commitment to the gospel, we go forth and witness all the things that you've said and the prophecy, and it's so powerful. And as we were trying to form our community in New Haven at the time, Dean and I and others, the Covenant Peace Community, and then Isaiah Peace Ministry, that's where I first met you, John, during those years in the 80s. And Dan was just so supportive. He was teaching part-time at Yale. And we had these amazing experiences together. And then we did the Trident 9 Plowshares Action, and Dan was so supportive. 1982, and writing us in jail, encouraging us. And then just fast forward, personal tragedies in my own family, including when my brother was murdered, Dan calling and consoling me, inviting me down for prayer and dinner, and it's so powerful. And then he presided at Colleen and my wedding. He left Phil's bedside, and Phil was near death, and he came and presided at the wedding, as did Frida. Came and offered a reading. Liz stayed back. So grateful for the Jonah House community and all that they offer to us.
You're breaking up, Art.
Family during those days, and then Phil died a week later. And then, by the way, Phil, the book that you mentioned, Testimony, contains this sermon that Dan gave at our wedding, which I was totally surprised that it would, find its way into this book. It's a powerful, powerful sermon, and I was just so grateful for it. Well, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me better?
A little bit.
But
you were really.
But anyway, the sermon that Dan gave at our wedding is in that book, Testimony, which is so powerful. And then just finally, being with Dan at the end, and he was kind of confined to his room so much, and so I said to him, "Hey Dan, you want to go out in the wheelchair? You want to go outside? You want to get some air? It's a pretty nice day. It's an April day, and he said, "Yeah, we got to check first though with the person in charge." So we did, and anyway, I love you all. Liz, thank you, and John, thank you, brother.
You're welcome. Great. Thanks, Art. I know we only have a few minutes left. A few people asked to speak. You can say something in the chat, but Bob Cushing, did you want to have a quick word? Welcome.
Yes, thanks. Thanks a lot. Appreciate what you're doing. Following up what Art said, one time when I got back from dropping off a letter of apology in Japan to the bishops there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I got tossed out of my parish, and Dan called me up and said, "Hey, I understand you're out of a job. This is Dan." I said, "Who?" "This is Dan Berrigan. I just thought I'd call you to support you, Bob." And I went, "Oh my gosh, Dan." And so I had met him 10 years before out at Richard Rohr's conference. And that's worth remembering, because both Richard and Dan were so incredibly shy of when they met each other, and both were so exultant in each other's presence. It was a beautiful thing to behold in 1995. So in 2005, Dan invited me up to come up and visit with him. So I stayed with Art for a while, Art Laffin at Dorothy Day Community, and I took a bus up, and I'm on the way into New York, and Dan calls me on my cell phone, and he says, "Bob, I need to ask your forgiveness." I said, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, I just got this invitation to go to Nicaragua. I got this free flight, and will you forgive me if I don't receive you and just go to Nicaragua for a week? I just love it. It would be so much fun." I said, "Oh my God, yeah, I'll go to Nicaragua, Dan, with my blessing." So I go all the way to New York and stay at Joseph House and talk about possibly working there, and didn't work out, but I just never forgot his generosity in reaching out, first of all, and his humility, incredible, in asking for forgiveness. I just laughed. And he was just the voice of gentleness, the voice of peace, the voice of the prophet. That's it.
That's great. Thank you, Bob. That's really great. Yeah, we used to go and see Richard Rohr right up through the 2000s when Dan, every year, and they were always like that. You say, well, Dan once said that Richard Rohr is the only person he ever met who reminded him of Merton. That he could sit and Richard could talk for an hour, and he wasn't sure whether he was listening to Thomas Merton or Richard Rohr, because they both can talk about anything forever. There's another comment. Jim Wilson, briefly, you want to offer a word wherever you are?
Yeah, just, well, John, thanks so much for doing this and for all the comments made by people. I just want to express to people that Dan really evolved over the years. I knew him when he was 44, I was 21. And he really evolved and taught me a lot, but I think young people taught him a lot too. So it was a good experience and I miss him.
Thanks, Jim. I miss him too. All his friends miss him. And I didn't talk about that. There's a lot of things I was going to talk about. Of course, I talked forever and I could talk for a year nonstop and still not finish all that I saw Dan do and say. But I thought he grew a lot, even the 30 years, 35 years I knew him. I don't know about anybody else, but I saw him change because he was constantly working on it. One thing, he got mellower and was letting go of anger. And when he talked about, instead of trying to make it happen, let it happen, which was very, very interesting way of seeing things compared to other well-known activists. Friends, I know we've been together for about 3 hours, like we said we would. I don't know has anybody found this helpful? Thumbs up or down, or is it okay? I'm looking for a little quiet feedback here. We didn't hear from Molly Rush or Jim Forrest, but if you see this, you were missed. And I think in the chat somewhere, there was information about Bill Kellerman's Zoom tomorrow. If you don't find it, write to us at the Beatitude Center. We'll send out that link. If I could just for a second make a commercial announcement about that. It's brand new. I just started this in November because of the pandemic and doing Zooms all the time on Jesus and Gandhi. And it's really great. We have all these wonderful guests coming up. Robert Ellsberg in 2 weeks, and Terry Wren on Gandhi and Jesus, and Marie Dennis on Pope Francis's call of nonviolence. And they said later in the year, Jim Lawson, Gandhi's grandson, Raj Mohan Gandhi, he wrote the definitive biography of Gandhi. It's going to be with us. And Jim Forrest is going to do 2 Saturday events on Dorothy Day, Merton, Dan, and Mahan. So please support us. Offer any donations if you can, or spread the word about what we're trying to do. Also, if you have any suggestions, as I said, about the Daniel Berrigan Literary Trust, to be honest with you, I need about $5,000 to do what I'd like to do. Because all the money from Dan's books go to the Jesuits and they don't want to help with it. I want to set up a state-of-the-art website, and I have other projects, so you can write me if you're interested in helping me do that. Meanwhile, how about we end with Dan's version of the Lord's Prayer, which he wrote. This is from the 1970s. And my hope and prayer is that we can all continue to reflect on these great things and Dan's great life and, continue on our own way to follow the nonviolent Jesus and be witnesses and apostles and prophets for peace. So this is the Lord's Prayer according to Daniel Berrigan, and we'll end the Zoom with that. Our Father, Mother, who are in the world and surpass the world, blessed be your presence in us, in animals and flowers, in still air and wind. May justice and peace dwell among us as you come to us. Your will be our will. You will that we be sisters and brothers, as bread is bread, water is itself, for our hunger, for quenching of thirst. Forgive us. We walk crookedly in the world, are perverse and fail of our promise. But we would be human if only you consent to stir up our hearts. Amen, everybody. God bless you. Be well. Blessings of peace. See you along the way. Take care. Special thanks to Frida and Liz for being here, and stay in touch. And you'll be getting the recording if you want to follow more. All the best to everybody. God bless. And we're going to sign off right now. Thanks.
Bless to you all. Thank you.